There are various alien bases around the world, definitely. And there is liaison with a very restricted group of scientific and technical intelligence specialists and military personnel. I asked one of my friends in Washington, I said, look, this was about 8 years ago. I said, look, you know I've been studying this since 1955, you know, it gets kind of frustrating. And he smiled. I said, yes, I appreciate that. I said, is there going to, you know, when is there going to be some kind of official disclosure to the effect that at least some of these things are reality? And he just looked at me and said, stay healthy.
Good.
And he went on to explain that the wisest course, there's no way they can come up with all this stuff all at once. It's got to be piecemeal. It has to be gradual disclosure.
What exactly took place over Los Angeles in 1942, the so-called Battle of Los Angeles, which was reported by newspapers of the day?
This is right, yes. It was the end of February 1942, when suddenly there was an air alarm and there were searchlights all over the place, and this lasted for 5 hours. 5-hour air alarm, and the Americans thought that this was a repetition of Pearl Harbor. They assumed they were being invaded by Japanese planes because unidentified aircraft had penetrated US airspace, and they could be seen clearly in the searchlight beams, but one in particular which was very large, and there is a photograph which was shown the next day in one of the Los Angeles papers, and it clearly shows something. You can't see it clearly, but there is something there at the apex of the searchlights. The other objects that you see in the photograph, we're not sure, because there were quite a lot of objects involved, one large one and some smaller, but it's difficult to tell whether the photograph shows shells exploding, because 1,430 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition were fired at these things. It's possible some of them are lens flares from the searchlights reflecting in the camera lens, so that's possible, but definitely there was something solid there, and nothing touched it. Nothing was shot down. There is a rumor that an American plane was shot down by friendly fire, but as far as I know, the planes didn't actually get off the ground because they could see what was happening with the the army shells. Nothing. So they knew that they would be powerless against these invaders.
Right. And what was the official explanation on what these crews were firing all their shells on?
Well, the official explanation was a document which has been reproduced. I've reproduced it in my books. Signed by General George C. Marshall, who was United States Army Chief of Staff at the time. And this was a secret memo prepared for President Roosevelt about the air alarm, confirming that unidentified airplanes were over Los Angeles and 1,430 rounds of ammunition were fired at these things to no effect. Nothing was shot down. And it was completely unexplained.
And it just disappeared out where it
well,
came
the
from?
larger object was seen by thousands of people proceeding at a leisurely pace toward the coast, and then it was never seen again.
Okay. You spoke in your presentation about certain events that took place over Scandinavia in the mid-40s.
Yes.
The objects were seen, and what were those objects, and what was the interest in terms of defense following that?
In the summer of 1946, there was a massive wave of what became known as ghost rockets. sometimes spook bombs they were called. They seem to be concentrated in Scandinavia, Sweden in particular. There's no doubt about that, but the fact of the matter is that it was a worldwide phenomenon. They were seen as far south as India. There were reports from Turkey, from Greece, and there were other events around the world at this time, but definitely the concentration was over Sweden, and for several weeks in the summer of 1946 these things were seen. There were thousands of reports, several thousand reports, and they were often seen like trailing fire, sometimes not trailing anything. They were generally described as tubular objects, and very occasionally wing-type protrusions were seen, but often no protrusions at all, such as would be required to guide a rocket, like guiding vanes on a rocket, such as a V2. The consensus of opinion at that time was that the Russians were test-flying V2 rockets captured from the Nazis, because both the Americans and the Russians had captured V2 Nazi rockets. And they were certainly doing some experiments with them, but in 1946 it was far too early for the Russians to have developed anything so sophisticated, because these things were diving into lakes, they were seen leaving lakes in some cases, they were encountered by Saab bombers. There was one craft which actually struck there was a collision with one of the Saab bombers, and that was...
The pilot was lost, I assume?
3-man crew was lost. This made headline story in the Washington Post, completely unexplained. And these were not anybody's rockets that we know of. They were not Russian, because one of the world's leading aviation historians, Bill Gunston, has confirmed in my book that there's no way so many sightings could be attributed to Russian experiments. And why would you fly them over, like, the middle of Stockholm? It just doesn't make any kind of sense. Besides, they didn't look anything like V2s.
Were they moving at variable speed?
Variable speed, sometimes proceeding in a leisurely pace, sometimes at tremendously high speeds,
right,
at varying altitudes. So it remains unexplained.
As is well known in popular mythology, a few days later there was the Roswell Crash of July 1947. In your estimation, or in your work, what consequences did that have for the UFO phenomenon and its relation to national security?
Well, already by 1946, if not earlier, I think actually during World War II, intelligence chiefs had realized that this was clearly a security threat, and we weren't dealing with enemy planes, because there were so many sightings during the World War II, not just of the so-called Foo Fighters. These were sort of rather amorphous, often globe-shaped objects which buzzed aircraft, particularly during bombing missions. American planes returning from or on their way to bombing missions, Royal Air Force planes. Many air forces encountered these things, but sometimes very large objects were seen. There's a description by the crew of a Lancaster in 1944 that encountered an enormous object, and the radar operator in the report that I got from him said that this thing was just dwarfed their Lancaster bomber. Their plane was just like a dot on a huge sheet of paper compared to this object, which eventually shot off. And it was definitely a disc-shaped object, on edge, with lots of bright lights all along the side. And so already the intelligence officials, because when they were debriefed, there were more than the usual amount of intelligence debriefing officers at Royal Air Force Oakington Base. And there were sightings after the war. There was even a crash, several crashes preceding Roswell. According to my information, there was one in August of 1945. There were about 3 alleged retrievals of alien vehicles during World War II.
In
various
Europe,
parts.
the European theater?
There was several. There was one in Europe. There was one in the United States in 1941 in Missouri. There was one reported near a naval station, and the United States Navy captured one of these craft near a naval base in Hawaii. And there were a couple of other incidents. So I think Roswell was not the first, neither was it the most important, but it was the one that made the headlines. But
it essentially leaked. Is that what you're saying? I mean, it was not supposed to make headlines, the Roswell Crash.
It was supposed to make headlines because the U.S. Army Air Forces issued a press release stating that the U.S. Army Air Forces had captured a flying saucer which had crashed on a ranch relatively near Roswell.
But so whoever...
And then the next day, it caused so much excitement all over the world that the story had to be suppressed, and they changed the story to say that this was merely a weather balloon which had come down, and they showed the remains of the weather balloon in a press conference the following day. But if I can just backtrack to May of 1947, by this time the Army and the Army Air Forces were well aware that they were dealing with unknown phenomena. And in May of 1947, one of these UFOs, or flying discs as they called them in the early days, was seen approaching a V-2 rocket. I think one of the first V-2 rocket launches, launched by the Werner von Braun and his team of captured German scientists. And it was observed to actually, it was flying round this V-2 rocket, and it caused it to come down prematurely. And this was officially conceded in a report which was published in a local newspaper. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Turner, who was the base commander at White Sands, the proving grounds where these rockets were being test flown, said that peculiar phenomena were responsible for the premature crash of a V-2 rocket. And that happened on more than one occasion. And this increased the resolve of the Army Air Forces to try and shoot some of these craft down, as they had done in 1942. Well, they did start shooting at them, and in several instances they were successful in bringing some of the flying discs down. My information from a very reputable source with background in aerospace, a guy who was also served in public office as the state representative for Las Cruces, New Mexico. He had some very good connections, and he, I'm sure, would go on camera with these claims. I've named him. His name is Andy Kistner, John Andy Kistner. And he provided me with a lot of incredible research material indicating what happened starting in May, June of 1947. The American Army and Army Air Forces started shooting at these things, and they brought several of them down, one of which became known collectively as the Roswell incident. And several days before the crash materials were found, these discs were seen wobbling around as if in some kind of unstable condition, and they took several days to come to ground, according to my information, after having been shot at. I don't know what type of weaponry was used against them, but I know that in addition to conventional anti-aircraft shells, they were using guided missiles with proximity fuses, which are primed to go off when they get actually right near the target. And I think it's likely that one of those, or a combination of both, brought these at least 2 discs down, which subsequently were retrieved. 2 discs were retrieved in 2 different locations. At least there were parts of wreckage in different areas in New Mexico, and that's what became known as the Roswell incident.
Do you see a direct relationship between those events and the signing of the National Security Act?
I do indeed. That was in September of 1947. absolutely no question that the National Security Act was drawn up specifically in view of an alien threat, because the American intelligence and a few other intelligence services around the world, I'm quite sure, were convinced by that time that we were dealing with a non-terrestrial threat. And I must say that the most astonishing thing for me, I mean, I was familiar with the fact that many pilots have lost their lives and their aircraft have disappeared pursuing these things. This is a very good reason for the cover-up. But what I was astonished to learn, thanks to Andy Kistner, was that, and I've reproduced newspaper documents, contemporary newspaper documents, following our attacks on these flying discs, there was an unprecedented worldwide series of air accidents, many of which, the majority of which were completely unexplained. This was not just the United States, this was all over the world, literally.
Military and civilian?
Military and civilian aircraft were either knocked out of the sky, or they crashed on takeoff. That was quite common. Or they crashed shortly after takeoff, and the official explanations were, oh, they ran out of fuel. You know, how many hundreds of planes are likely to run out of fuel around the same time following takeoff? It doesn't make any sense. The planes actually could not get off the ground in many cases, and quite clearly this was retaliation for us having attacked some of these craft.
Considering the many UFOs, for example, over Washington DC in 1952, in your research, what was done in that period to deal with public inquiry and concern about this whole phenomenon?
Well, in July of 1952, on two occasions at least, Washington DC airspace was penetrated by unknown targets. It was confirmed on radar. I have details in the book of sightings, not just of odd amorphous radar blobs. I mean, there were giant craft that was seen at very high altitude over Washington at the time, which pilots were ordered to try and knock out of the sky, and they did not succeed. But some awesome events took place, and sometimes the craft, there are reports of I think there's one report from a university professor in the middle of Washington, downtown Washington, who saw one of these things actually below the top of a nearby building. So they came quite close, and there was absolute pandemonium. I mean, there were jets were on the alert all the time. Many pilots reported encounters with these things. Several of the craft were fired upon, and it's known that something was knocked off a craft, because it's been confirmed by a Canadian government scientist, Wilbur Smith, who actually handled one of the pieces from a flying saucer which had been shot at, and probably knocked out of the sky. We don't know that. But the official explanation, there was the largest press conference since World War II was held in July of 1952, at which General Samford of US Air Force stated that there's a percentage of these reports which are unexplained, but he hinted that the official explanation was that it was due to a temperature inversion, and therefore you were getting these spurious radar contacts and things. But that was simply a cover-up. I mean, it was perfectly obvious that something very solid was being seen. And
that was a very effective sort of denial. There wasn't a lot of... It sort of disappeared.
It was quite effective, but a lot of people were left puzzled, because there were headline stories every day, you know, on at least two occasions in July of 1952. It wasn't just one occasion. There was when these events happened in that month, in that year.
But following that big press conference, there was not a lot of, or any response from the Air Force regarding this incident.
No.
No. What exactly did Robert Seibacher reveal about the U.S. involvement with the UFOs and its security classification to Wilbur Smith?
Yeah. There is a 1950 Canadian government Department of Transport top secret report, which I've reproduced in my book, I reproduced, I think, one page from it, part of a page from it. The most important. It was a 3-page document, top secret, from Wilbur Smith, confirming the information that he had acquired from an American government source. And he doesn't name the scientist, but we now know, and it's been confirmed by Dr. Robert Sarbacker. And he subsequently confirmed in interviews with Stanton Friedman, nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman, that yes, what was in the interview was absolutely correct. That this is what Wilbur Smith said was that flying saucers exist. Their modus operandi is unknown, but a concentrated effort is being made by a small team headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. Bush, of course, was one of the prime movers behind the top-secret Manhattan project to develop the world's first atomic bombs. And it was considered, as it states in this document, that the entire matter it's classified higher, 2 points higher than the hydrogen bomb. Now you can imagine how sensitive the hydrogen bomb was in 1950, but here we have the flying saucer subject at a higher classification. And a lot of the research work in those early days was done by the nuclear physicists, actually, because these were the guys, not only because of their familiarity with advanced technology dealing with nuclear weapons and things, but the fact that they were subject to what's known in the intelligence world as compartmentalization. It was used for the first time to deal with the secrecy aspects of nuclear weapons. And this was a system developed by General Leslie Groves, who said each man must know only as much as he needs to know. So you could be working next to someone on a project and not know exactly what they knew and everything. So there were these compartments. It's called sensitive compartmented information. So there were very, very high degrees of classification, and the people in the nuclear business were the guys that were handling this at that time, mostly. Not entirely, but mostly.
Right.
Sarbacker confirmed that
right.
Alien bodies had been retrieved. My information is that Wilbur Smith was actually shown the alien bodies.
Wow.
He got clearance, sufficient clearance to see the alien bodies at a certain
from the
base
Air Force
in the United States, at a certain Air Force base in the United States. Yeah.
Right. So at this point, in the mid-50s and so on, what agencies and services began taking this very seriously behind the scenes? Was it everybody, or was it...
Well, I would say since World War II it's been taken seriously by a number of agencies, such as the Office of Strategic Services, which was the forerunner of the CIA, by Army intelligence, by several intelligence branches in the Navy and Army Air Forces and so on. And since that time, right up to the present day, we have the involvement of the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is a military defense agency. The FBI has had a long involvement. Air Force Intelligence, particularly the Office of Special Investigations, that's AFOSI. The Office of Naval Intelligence actually I believe, had a great deal more knowledge than some of the other organizations since an earlier time. And there's rivalry between the agencies, each one wanting to find out what the other knows. So there's a problem there. But all the service agencies, many other agencies in the nuclear industry are involved as well. So, there are about 16 intelligence agencies in the United States, and I would say not all of them, but many of them are involved in UFO research. And of course, people say, well, where's the proof for this? Why is it that scientists are so skeptical and rubbish reports of flying saucers and UFOs? Well, it's quite simple. The proof is there, but it is restricted to those with need to know in the intelligence community. People don't realize that there are thousands of scientists who work on classified projects worldwide, not just UFOs. They have very high security clearances. They cannot talk about what they have discovered, what they are working on. I mean, do you think the people working on the Manhattan Project could talk to their colleagues in the white world, as it's called, the open world of scientists, say, yeah, we're working on a nuclear device, it works like this, and publish the results in Scientific American? No. Likewise, there are thousands of people I know worldwide investigating this behind the scenes, but unless you have clearance, you will not find out. So I can understand why scientists, public scientists if you like, are skeptical, but the proof is there, but it is being withheld by those with the appropriate need to know.
Which presidents since World War II, I mean American presidents, have been in the know? I mean, have had a need to know?
My information certainly is that President Truman, and then shortly afterwards, well, a number of presidents did have access over the years, right up to the present time. I can give you some ideas. Certainly I know that that President Kennedy had access based on information provided by someone in the White House staff to me, which I published in the book. And according to my information, in 1961-62, Kennedy requested permission to view alien bodies stored at a certain Air Force base, and his wish was granted, and he was taken. I'm not given dates, but I was told that he was taken on Air Force One. They were accompanied by many generals. It was organized by General McHugh. The entire mission was top secret, and it's still top secret to this day, of course, but I luckily gained some information. All I know is that the plane took Kennedy, Air Force One, to Tyndall Air Force Base in South Florida, where he was taken to a special medical facility where he was allowed to view the alien bodies. I don't know any more than that. I know that Richard Nixon had also seen the alien bodies. He took a friend of his to show them, to display them to him as well, I'm told. There have been a number of others. I think that George Bush Sr., not the present incumbent of the White House, though he did have a military background, the present president, he was a military pilot, as a matter of fact, flew F-102 Delta Dagger, which is quite a sophisticated aircraft, so, you know, he can't be that stupid. But anyway, I believe that his father, previous President George Bush, had more knowledge than most of the United States presidents, and I have been hoping to interview him for quite some time, and an application was put in to him via a retired general friend of mine, and there is some possibility in the future I might get to talk to him, but I doubt it somehow. But there are a number of other presidents who have had access as well. Some have been denied. I think President Carter was given, I mean, he'd been a Navy guy. The people withholding this information, the cabal, if you like, are not very happy with presidents who don't have military background, like Clinton, who, you know, reportedly was a draft dodger for the Vietnam War. So he tried very hard to find out what was going on, but was denied access. That is for sure. As far as the present incumbent of the White House is, George W. A good friend of mine is a friend of the present president, and asked him 3 years ago at the White House, said, look, come on, tell me what's going on, because this guy is a journalist and he's very keen on the subject. He said, come on, what's going on, tell me, what have you been told? And Bush stiffened and said, ask Cheney.
Right.
So that's Vice President Dick Cheney, of course, and he is definitely an insider, according to my information, and there are quite a few others.
Where does NASA fit into all of this? Because it was created supposedly as a civilian agency, but
well, first of all, I have the NASA physical handbook, security handbook. You know, you can get it, you know, from one of the NASA offices, I think, although it was sent to me, I forget by whom now. But I mean, thousands of people who are contracted to work for NASA, you can have secret clearances, top secret clearances, and higher. So, you know, there's a lot of classified work done by NASA, and it's proven they have admitted officially a serious interest in UFOs. I've reproduced the document in Need to Know. That, you know, people must report this and that, it's very important, stuff must be reported immediately, and so on and so forth. And they've even sort of hinted that they were in charge of inquiries about UFOs. Inquiries to the White House were to be sent to NASA.
if Gordon Brown, for example,
Yes.
were to contact you, a civilian researcher,
Yeah.
saying, "I'm not entirely sure the Americans are giving us the whole
Yes,
story."
well, you know, I mean, it hasn't happened yet, but I have briefed a number of people in high office, not as high as that.
No.
But I can tell you that there is a lot of interest in certain countries. France, for example, at high levels, there's good knowledge and appreciation of the problems associated with releasing information about all this. So, well, I gladly take up any offer to assist our
But you
Prime
agree that
Minister.
the Americans have not been forthcoming with their allies on this subject?
No, I don't think they have. Again, it would depend on position. Air Marshal Sir Peter Horsley, who was a friend of mine, he was working in the Ministry of Defence on the UFO situation. He was also working at Buckingham Palace as an aide, military aide to Prince Philip and the Queen for 7 years. Sir Peter claims to have had a 2-hour meeting with an extraterrestrial human-appearing being in the middle of London in 1954, which is absolutely outrageous. But I mean, this guy was Deputy Chief of Strike Command with his finger on the nuclear trigger. He hadn't gone mad. He reported it to the Duke of Edinburgh at the time, who has always had a very strong interest in the subject. He told me that the most disturbing thing about this 2-hour meeting was, first of all, that this guy, whoever he was, because he didn't say, you know, "Hi, I'm from another planet," this guy was completely telepathic, could read his mind, and he knew all Britain's top secret nuclear secrets. That he found very, very disturbing. But he told me that he had very good connections in Washington and with Defence Liaison in the Ministry of Defence when he was himself studying UFO reports at the Air Ministry, as it was then called. He told me that he frequently tried to get access. He kept saying, "Come on, you guys, you're obviously withholding a lot of information." He was saying this to his American, and they said, sorry, Sir Peter, we can't give you any information on that. So, yes, we're not. Certainly, my country is not privy to everything that's going on.
If you were to estimate the situation of the relationship between this planet and one or more extraterrestrial races, are we talking surveillance or conflict vis-a-vis the rumored military space program?
I think there has been and continues to be both conflict and surveillance with one or more alien species. Others, I'm convinced, are neutral or friendly, but there is a threat, and there has been a threat posed by some alien species. Now, let me redefine the word alien. Alien actually doesn't necessarily mean extraterrestrial.
Right.
I am convinced, and I'm sure this will come out one day, that there have been aliens on planet Earth for millions of years longer than Homo sapiens. I think they have long had space travel capability, and I'm talking about ancient civilizations, if you like, who still have remnants here. I've been told that by very good sources in Washington that aliens have long established bases, undersea bases here, some of them very, very large indeed, and in many locations around the world. I was actually given specific locations in some cases, and that there's not a great deal we can do about it. I mean, these guys are in charge. To a certain extent, we're neutral. We are, to a certain extent, we are powerless, really, to do anything about it.
Right.
But I do think that we have allies, definitely. There are some who are not just technologically, but mentally and spiritually way ahead of us, so they're not interested in wiping us out. And they, I'm sure, would like to help humanity progress to the point where there is more open connections with the universe.
Right. Actually, one more question just popped in my head. I recently, some informed, I don't know who, guy on the internet claimed, and this rang true, that there is an agreement between the Australian government and the American government to use remote facilities or to use remote areas of Australia as a test facility for advanced aircraft. Have you heard anything about that?
I've heard rumours, and I think it's probably true, yes. Based on what I've been told, I was told by a Washington source that there is an alien base in the vicinity of Pine Gap, not at Pine Gap itself, as has been suggested. This is near Alice Springs. But there is a base, a large base, and that there is liaison.
The other sort of rising powers, other powers on this planet, say Russia, China, India, in rapid growth, both economically and militarily. What's their take on all this?
I'm glad you asked that question. It's very important to stress this is not an American phenomenon. It didn't start in America. It's been going on for thousands of years. It is global. There is the Russian intelligence people have been interested since World War II. Many European governments have had an interest. China has long had an interest. You cannot become an official UFO researcher in China unless you have a PhD. And there were like 3,000. 15 years ago, there were 3,600 formal UFO researchers in China. And official research in China is sanctioned by the Chinese Academy of Sciences, just as is official research in the former Soviet Union. A lot of the work is done in conjunction with the Russian Academy of Sciences. It is global. It's been going on for a very long time, and there is liaison between some governments. Certainly I know for a fact that at one period, certainly during the Gorbachev Reagan administrations, they liaised and discussed the possibility of collaboration in the event of an extraterrestrial invasion of a threat, and that was formally agreed by both presidents. So there has been a degree of collaboration, which is good news because it's constructive. It means there's less likelihood of, say, Soviet Union, former Soviet Union and United States firing nuclear missiles at each other. They know that their missile sites have been paralyzed on many occasions by unknown flying objects.
And this has been documented officially, is that
correct?
This
has been documented by a number of Russian officials, and I've published a lot of information, and some very disturbing cases, UFOs landing at radar sites, for example, In 1990 there was this huge triangular craft which landed at a radar base, knocked out one of the radar stations, small portable radar stations. And there was missing time. You've heard about alien abductions and things. Some of the soldiers experienced missing time. All sorts of bizarre things happened, and this was confirmed by quite a few people. And in 1977, I mean, this is most incredible. This information only came out a few years ago. In 1977, President Yuri Andropov, who also headed the KGB, set up a 10-year top-secret research institute to investigate UFO sightings, a military investigation involving 4 million soldiers throughout the territories of the Soviet Union to gather information to a central committee panel and so forth. And of course they had many, probably 1 million or so civil servants engaged as well in processing all the reports. But that is a reality. It has been confirmed by many Russian generals that there was this incredible, unique 10-year research effort.
Right. If you were to comment shortly on Ben Rich's former head of Lockheed,
yeah.
Skunk Works, he has made comments that essentially we have technology for
yes.
star travel.
Absolutely. This is true. My information is that we have some very sophisticated devices. How many there are, I don't know. How they compare technologically with the more advanced alien craft, I do not know. But there appears to be a coming together of technology very, very slowly. And I think some UFOs that we see are definitely top secret aircraft and spacecraft, no question about it. And it's interesting, not just Ben Rich, but others have said, we have the technology now to go to the stars. There are just a few equations to work out, and then the future looks very promising in that direction.
Timothy Good, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.